No sound. Good evening, everyone. I see already there's a very nice group that's gathered here on this Zoom location to hear about Yerushalayim. We're going to begin in just another minute again, as is the custom. Let's give those who somehow wandered through cyberspace and clicked one time too many or too few. Let's give them a chance to get here, and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome everybody. Great to see your names, if not you. And it's wonderful to be able to spend some time together to talk about a major and significant day in the history of the Jewish people. No question about it. First of all, I'm hearing some noises, which means either people are trying to communicate with me that they can't hear me. Let me see, is there anybody who has allowed their picture to show? Hi, show Rabbi, can you hear me? Good, okay, if you can, then the others can. And I'm gonna put everybody on mute just to make sure that we don't have any background noise. Okay, great. We'll see if we have time at the end for questions or comments. Everybody's got a lot to share, I'm sure, about Yerushalayim. So, I began by saying that it's a very significant day in the history of the Jewish people. I don't think that I'm overstating it. As we all know, on the 28th of Iyar, in the year 5727, the Jewish armies liberated Yerushalayim from the control of the Jordanians, who had wrested control of it from the Jews, or from international control, as the British mandate tried to create Palestine and Israel. And there was a war, and the Jews got chased out of the Jewish quarter. And from 1948 until 1967, no Jew was allowed in Jerusalem. So certainly no Jew was allowed at the Kotel. And even though it was a violation of the agreement, nothing happened. Nobody seemed to care. But in 1967, the Six-Day War, on that Wednesday, for the first time in history, not just since 1948, but for the first time in history since the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Jews were in control of the city of Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, the holy city of Yerushalayim. And one cannot overstate the significance of such a thing. It's not really just a political event or a military event. It's a religious event, because everything in natural laws of history pointed to the fact that it would never happen. And only through the retrospective that we have, because it's been in our hands for over 50 years, does it seem like a relatively predictable event. But again, to put it in the course of history, we were exiled from Yerushalayim. The city was trashed. The Beis HaMikdash, the glory of Yerushalayim, was destroyed. We were taken into captivity, sold as slaves, tortured. Millions died during this period of the destruction. We wandered through exile with no national entity, with no army, with no one to protect us, with tremendous suffering, with pogroms and inquisitions and tortures and abuse and anti-Semitism and isolation and discrimination and everything in the world. Never a day passed where a believing Jew didn't mention Yerushalayim at Shacharis, Mincha, Marav, at benching, breakfast, lunch, supper, at weddings, and so on and so forth. And here, all of a sudden, here come the Jews, and they are now in control of Yerushalayim. It's absolutely mind-boggling. A beginning of a fulfillment of predictions that came from the Nevi'im, who said, before the destruction, you're going to be exiled, you're going to suffer, it's going to be long and bitter, and you're going to come back. And here we are. And this day, Yom Yerushalayim, your Jerusalem Day, has been, shall we say, distorted in the way that it has been observed, because many people see it as a nationalistic day, as a political day, as a day that furthers whatever political argument we have. And the celebration of Yom Yerushalayim in some quarters has turned into something other than a recognition of the hand of God in Jewish history, and something other than a recognition of the Kedusha, the holiness of Yerushalayim. And the fact that it is literally, Yerushalayim is the source of our energy, the source of our very being. It's what we long for from time immemorial, before there ever was a concept of nationhood in the world, for any nation, or statehood. There was the yearning for Yerushalayim. It was the throne of King David. It was the location of the Sanhedrin. It was the source of Torah, Ki Mitzion Teitzei Torah, etc. So again, this day, Yom Yerushalayim, is a very special day. Before we get into what we want to do tonight, which is really try to introduce you to things about Yerushalayim that maybe people don't know, before we get into that, just a note about the tremendous challenge that Yom Yerushalayim represents religiously, which is, how do you mark it? How do you celebrate it? Well, that depends on how you define it. And how do you define it? The answer is we don't know, because we don't define a day's religious significance based on our emotions. We do define it based on insight into how this plays out in God's plan. Hanukkah itself was not established as a holiday right away, even though there was a tremendous victory when the Greeks were forced out. But as the Talmud says, L'shana acheres, at some later year, the sages established Hanukkah as a Yom Tov. Why did they wait? Because even people of great and profound understanding, like the sages of the Talmud, need the perspective of time to be able to assess exactly whether or not it is a significant development that will make a difference for eternity. They determined that Hanukkah would, and that's why we still celebrate Hanukkah now, long after any of the practical implications of the victory over the Greeks are here. So we have a difficult time assessing exactly what to do with Yom Yerushalayim. We know it's a significant day because we know something happened that was unprecedented, and it made other things possible. And Yerushalayim has just flourished since then in so many ways, not the least of which is that it is a center of Torah study for people of all ages, literally from 100 years old to 100 days old. You can't go anywhere in Yerushalayim without encountering significant houses of study and schools and yeshivas and seminaries, girls' schools, etc. You can't go anywhere in Yerushalayim without encountering that. You go down the street at 11 o'clock at night, and the white light, as I indicated in another forum last week, the white light that emanates from the buildings is almost inevitably going to be from a Beit Midrash, where people are sitting and studying at 11, 12 o'clock at night, in the dozens and dozens in each of these sites, and some of these sites in the hundreds and even in the thousands. That's the industry of Yerushalayim. So there's something very special going on. We don't know yet. And we don't have the power or the ability to declare the day to be a religious holiday. Although those who experienced the miracle personally of the liberation of Yerushalayim did say Hallel on this day, because they were the recipients of a miracle. They were under siege. the first 2 or 3 days of the Six-Day War, Jerusalem was under siege from the Jordanians. Famously, the Mir Yeshiva, which was right near the Mandelbaum Gate, was shelled. There's still a very notable little mark in the side of the building where the shell damaged some bricks. They were all in shelters. Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz, the renowned sage, leader, Rosh Yeshiva of the Mir Yeshiva, was said to treat the 28th of Iyar as a personal miracle day, and was said to recite Hallel, and told others who were in his predicament to do so. And that there's no question that it was a special day because they were saved from a siege where the Jordanians broadcast on the radio that they were going to take over the entire city of Jerusalem, including West Jerusalem, Israeli Jerusalem, the modern Jerusalem, and it was going to be an Arab city. So, and with that, as you can tell, even from the small uprising that's going on right now in Jerusalem, that's not just a political problem, that was a major life and death issue. Okay, so the problem of Yerushalayim that was presented to us when Yerushalayim was captured by the Jewish army is still with us, which is, how do we deal with Yerushalayim, and what kind of responsibility do we have to God for having Yerushalayim in our hands? Not everything about the recapture of Yerushalayim is positive, because we, as God's people, are not necessarily bringing only holy things to the city of Yerushalayim. And that's part of the challenge. When you are in control of a nuclear reactor, you've got to know how to handle nuclear energy. When you're in control of the nuclear reactor of the Jewish people, the spiritual energy that sourced us from Abraham all the way to today, then you got to know what to do with it. You have to know how to handle it. And some of us know, some of us don't know. And Yerushalayim is a mixed bag. And so it's not all a wonderful thing because we dare not disgrace the holiness of Yerushalayim with behavior that's imported from the rest of the world. So I'm just giving a background to the confusion that comes. The goal today, right now, is really, I want to kind of like airdrop ourselves into Yerushalayim. You know, sometimes if you want to take a tour of a city or a foreign culture that you don't know much about, one way to do that is to study about it before you go on the tour. And you read background and history and biography and so on and so forth. Another way of getting to know a city is just to drop in and take in the smells and the sights and the culture and just see how people are going about their daily business. And you don't know a lot, but you get a sense of what's going on in that city. So what I want to do is really do that kind of a thing. I want to do an airdrop into Yerushalayim historically, into Yerushalayim halachically, and through that, we'll gain access to a certain angle, kind of like a walking tour through the city, but a walking tour through some of the practices and attitudes that emanate from Yerushalayim. By the way, walking tours of Yerushalayim, besides the fact that you see a tremendous amount as you walk through physically Yerushalayim, the street names of Yerushalayim just scream Jewish history. It's an amazing conglomeration of Jewish history. The streets of Yerushalayim, Rehov HaRambam, Rehov HaRamban, Nachmanides Street, Maimonides Street, Rabbi Akiva Street, Ben Azai Street, Rehov Hillel, Jabotinsky Street, King George V Street, everything, Golda Meir Street, Sderot Herzl, the Herzl Highway and the Golda Meir Highway and Rabin and Kikar Davidka, the Davidka Square. And we're talking about everything from Avraham Avinu all the way down to modern Jewish history. And sometimes the intersections of these streets are amazing because some of the people there after whom these streets are named would have violently disagreed with each other. Walking through Yerushalayim is just an amazing experience. Ezra, I mean, you can go on and on and on, just the street names of Yerushalayim. So we're not going to do that. We're here in Atlanta, Georgia, but we're going to go through intellectually. We're going to go through a little bit of the city of Yerushalayim. So first of all, I want to read to you something from Rav Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen Cook. Tzvi Yehuda Cook was a Rosh Hashiva Merkaz Rav. He was the son of Rav Avram Cook, Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, the famous. When we say Rav Cook, we usually mean Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen. His son was the Rosh Hashiva of Merkaz Harav, which is a very, very passionately religious and Zionistic yeshiva, which led to what they call the settler movement, the movement after the 6-Day War, to populate the cities of Shechem and Yehuda v'Shamron, and Hebron especially, and many, many other places in Yehuda v'Shamron, in what we call the territories. And he articulated more than anyone else the view that we're living in Messianic times, and that what's going on is pre-Messianic in the sense not only that it's spectacular, but that it clearly is the hand of God setting things up for the ultimate coming of the Mashiach and the restoration of the Davidic dynasty and the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. And he was an eminently religious figure who lived day and night looking for the hand of God, teaching Torah, living Torah, and his followers were also extremely pious individuals who saw tremendous amount of Kedusha in Yerushalayim. So I just want to read to you his description of the events of the 28th of Iyar that happened today in 1967, the day that Yerushalayim was finally captured. He writes like this: "It is impossible to forget that day," he recalled. "Already for several days, the situation in the city was tense. Many of the yeshiva students had enlisted in the war. On the second day of the week, the 26th of Iyar, a student approached me as I was walking to the morning prayer at the yeshiva. He told me that the war had begun. That was Monday morning, and that the Arab Legion was boasting that it would conquer all of Jerusalem. Rumors reached me about battles on the outskirts of the city. A friend phoned me and related in the name of Harav Shlomo Goren, the Israel Defense Forces chief rabbi, that Tzahal units were advancing and getting closer to the old city of Jerusalem. This was nerve-trembling news. Each hour, expectation quickened. One of the students who had enlisted raced back to the yeshiva during an hour break and announced that tomorrow, with the Almighty's help, our paratroopers would reach the Kotel. All of us were filled with hope and trembling. On the fourth day of the week, an officer knocked on the door of my house. This is Wednesday, Yom Revi'i, Wednesday. He had come with a message from my Rav Goren. The Rav is invited by the chief rabbi of the army to come to the Kotel, he announced. An armored car is waiting downstairs. Harav David Cohen, the Nazir, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, I'll interrupt to say the Nazir was a man who, like, all he did was study Torah, did not talk, did not interrupt ever for any discussion about almost anything. A very holy man, very close to Rav Kook. So he says, Harav David Cohen, the Nazir, joined us on the way. He too had been invited by his son-in-law, Harav Goren. The army car progressed slowly amidst the joyous crowds who were thronging the streets of the city, thousands of singing and dancing people. Many of them had tears of joy in their eyes over the liberation of Jerusalem. On the way, the officer told me that the moment the paratroopers had reached the perimeter of the Kotel, a soldier who was a student at our yeshiva climbed to the top row of stones on the wall and unfurled the Israeli flag over the heights of the Kotel. His commander promised him a reward for his deed and asked him to state his request. Quote, "The greatest honor for me," he answered, "is that you send an army rabbi to bring our teacher here, Harav Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen Cook, the Rosh Hashiva of Merkaz Harav." The officer also told us that Rav Goren had been among the first to reach the Kotel in the face of fire from Arab snipers who had continued to shoot from their places of hiding. He clutched a Torah scroll in one hand and a shofar in the other. Fighters who had survived furious battles cried like children when they heard the shofar blast of the chief rabbi. They admired his courage of heart and his self-sacrifice to remain all of the time at the head of the battle with the paratroopers who had burst through from the Mount of Olives to the Kotel. Many of our boys were wounded in the charge. To my question, through which gate of the old city had they reached the Kotel, the familiar voice of a soldier from our yeshiva said, Baruch Hashem, all of the gates are open. Another student, a rabbi in the army, rushed up to me at the Kotel and told me that he had received permission from Army Command to hold mincha prayer at the wall. It was the first national prayer at the Kotel after a 1900-year separation, a prayer which was utter cleavage to Hashem. Every eye was filled with tears. Soldiers prostrated themselves on the ground in front of the Kotel. Others wedged their fingers between the stones of the wall. Everyone chanted Tehillim, a song of ascent. When the Lord brought back the exiles of Zion, we were like those who dream, Hayinu kecholmim. Before we left the liberated city, I was interviewed by radio and television reporters from Israel and from outside the land. They wanted to know my opinion on what had happened. Behold, I said, we announced to all of Israel and to all of the world that by a divine command, we have returned to our home, to our holy city. From this day forth, we shall never budge from here. We have come home. Those are the words of Rav Yehuda Cook. And I've shared in other times, maybe with many of you, the fact that I was privileged to be only 25 miles away with my family in Bnei Brak, listening on the radio in a blackout when we heard Rav Goren actually recite the Shechayanu, blow the shofar, and say Kaddish for the soldiers who died capturing Yerushalayim. An extremely powerful moment that Wednesday night. And it is also part of the legacy of the war that more people died capturing Yerushalayim than who died in the Sinai campaign when they routed the Egyptian forces in the Sinai in that same war. The paratroopers paid a terrible price as they fought foot by foot, or we should say meter by meter, as they were approaching Yerushalayim on that Monday and Tuesday, before they finally came down from Mount Olives on Wednesday through Lion's Gate and broke through to the Temple Mount and then down to the Kotel. By the way, the flag that they're talking about was indeed hoisted on top of a wall, but it wasn't actually the Kotel. It was a wall connecting to the Kotel. And that famous picture that you see that shows those Israeli soldiers bunched together with their eyes turned heavenward. They're looking up at the flag there. And as you can tell from the angle, they're not looking up at the top of the Kotel, they're looking at the top of a wall connected to the Kotel. Of course, being as young as they were and not having been in Yerushalayim ever in their lives, the soldier thought they had climbed to the top of the Kotel, but they had been actually in very close proximity to the Kotel, but not on the Kotel itself. Either way, it was a very special moment. Perhaps that's what gives me a very emotional connection to the whole experience of Yerushalayim. When I was about 8 years older, studying in Yerushalayim, I used to break away and just walk around the walls of Yerushalayim. As you know, in the ramparts, it's possible to walk around almost the entire city, except for the section that literally is on the Temple Mount, which is prohibited for us to go in. And that was during a time when it was actually safe to do so, back in the 70s. So Yerushalayim is a very special place. So what we want to do now is kind of get a sense of what Yerushalayim is. So first of all, I took the opportunity to review some of the special practices and prohibitions that were instituted that reflect the special status of Yerushalayim. And there's a famous sefer that lists, it's a 4-volume sefer by Rabbi Yisrael Shapansky, who goes through all the customs of the Jewish people, starting all the way back, believe it or not, from before the Torah was given, and all the rabbinic enactments and everything. And he talks about all the practices in Yerushalayim, and he breaks them into several categories. So one category that he talks about is practices that derive from the fact that Yerushalayim did not belong to any of the tribes. All of Israel, as you know, was divided up and allocated to various tribes. There was a whole system that Yehoshua led to give Eretz Yisrael to the various Shvatim, to the various tribes. And Yerushalayim lo nitchalkal Shvatim. Yerushalayim was not divided up to the tribes. It was in quote unquote an international city, different kind of international. It was an intertribal city. It belonged to everybody, or actually belonged to nobody, and that's for obvious reasons. There was a little strip of land. Yehuda and Binyamin actually shared the place of the temple. The Beis HaMikdash itself, according to most opinions, was split, where the Holy of Holies ends up being in Binyamin, and his share, and the other part of the Beis HaMikdash where the Mizbeach was, at least a part of the Mizbeach, the altar, was in Yehuda's section. There's a reason for that. We're going to get into a little bit of that. But in general, Yerushalayim did not belong to any one of the tribes. So as a result of that, there are some practices that may be fascinating to you, maybe not. So for example, we're familiar with the law of the Ben Sorah Amora, the rebellious, gluttonous child, an amazing and mysterious and confounding chapter in the Torah, where the Torah describes that under certain very limited and specific conditions, when a pre-bar mitzvah kid is rebellious in drinking and in eating certain volumes and refusing direction from his parents, the parents are required to actually take him to the elders of the city. And actually, the Torah says that such a child is put to death. Now, the Talmud says that it never happened and it wasn't designed to happen. It's a theoretical concept that's meant to teach us certain things. Actually, one opinion in the Talmud says that it did happen, and he says, I actually sat on his grave. Many people interpret that statement to mean also that it didn't happen, but he means metaphorically something else. Either way, the law of the Ben Sorah Amora did not apply in Yerushalayim. Very interesting, because it says the passage refers to the city and his place, Mikamo, his place. And since only when the city belongs to someone and when people in the city own their land, can you have the law of the Ben Sorah Amora? So there are two ways of really approaching that. Like, what's that? What does that mean? Why would there not be the law of the Ben Sorah Amora, the gluttonous son, in Jerusalem? So Reb Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, known as the Meshech Chachma, after the book in which this thought appears, he says, based on the Talmud Psachim, actually describes a Kohen who was named Yochanan ben Naharbai. Yochanan ben Naharbai was a Kohen who was able to eat tremendous amounts of meat, which actually was a positive, because there was a big problem in the Beis HaMikdash, and that was that much of the meat of the karbanos was not allowed to be left over till the morning. Meaning there were parts of certain sacrifices, parts of a chatos that went to the sin offering that went to the Kohen, parts of an asham, the guilt offering that went to a Kohen. There were many, many karbanos that Kohanim themselves ate if the owners themselves didn't eat. And if it was left over, it was no, sir. You were not allowed to leave it over. And therefore, it had to be dispersed and given out and eaten by different Kohanim. So Yochanan ben Naharbai was known to be able to consume huge amounts of food. And there was therefore, under his watch, there was no nosar, there was no food left over, no meats left over, and therefore they didn't have to be burnt. So you can't blame a young kid in Yerushalayim for being gluttonous when he is around somebody who's actually performing a mitzvah by eating so much. That's what the Meshech Chachma says, meaning he's raised in Yerushalayim. What do you want from him? So he took it the wrong way. And he's very self-indulgent and so on and so forth. But there, says the Meshech Chachma, we're not going to have a Ben Sarah Mara in Yerushalayim. Okay, that's one way of looking at that. Another way of looking at the same law is just the opposite. The Talmud, it's interesting, the Jerusalemite Talmud says that the bottom line problem with the Ben Sarah Mara is that after all of his behavior, he'll forget any of his learning. None of his Torah is going to make a difference to him. And therefore, as we say, Neharag al Shem Sofo, he's killed for what we see. In the end, nothing good is going to come from him. He's going to actually end up even murdering. And therefore, he's actually executed before he can actually do the damage. Again, a very confounding and very difficult chapter in the Torah, what the concept means. But says this approach, the reason there was no Ben Sarah or Mara in Yerushalayim is because Yerushalayim it wasn't easy to ever lose your Torah. Ki mitzion tetzei Sarah. The Torah emanates from Yerushalayim. In Yerushalayim, there were the Kohanim. The Kohanim were free of any responsibilities. They only worked about 2 weeks a year because there were so many Kohanim, and they had divided up they assigned their different watches to different weeks of the year. And the Kohanim therefore spent all their time studying Torah. And there's even a law that people who brought Maaser Sheni to Yerushalayim, the Torah says, eat your tithe, your second tithe in Yerushalayim. Why? L'man yilmadu liyara, in order to learn to fear God. So Tosfos, in a couple of places in the Talmud, asks, what does eating fruit in Jerusalem have to do with learning to fear God? And Tosfos explains that when you spend time in Yerushalayim, you inevitably absorb the atmosphere of the Kohanim, who were the dominant, Kohanim and the Levium were the dominant people serving the Beis HaMikdash. It was all about alacrity, intensity, focus, keeping your eye on the ball. What was the ball? The ball was the industry of the Beis HaMikdash. And just to watch the Kohanim do their job with precision and with devotion, it was almost impossible to function as a Kohen unless you were totally aware at every moment of what you're doing, because much of what you were doing in the Beis HaMikdash would have been ruined if you lapsed in your thought. You could actually ruin a carbon by thinking the wrong thing. So there was just a tremendous amount of inspiration available, similar, lahavdil, to what is possible if you appreciate the discipline of the palace guard. When you go look at Buckingham Palace and you look at the palace guard and you realize what it takes to get to the point where people can be that disciplined and that coordinated, that was nothing compared to what went on in the Beis HaMikdash with the Kohanim. So anybody who lived in Yerushalayim absorbed the fear of heaven simply by seeing the Beis HaMikdash, the holy temple, and by seeing the Kohanim ba'avodasam. And therefore, the Ben Sarah Mara could never forget his Torah, no matter how bad he was. And therefore, somebody coming from Yerushalayim there was no din of Ben Sarah Mara. So that's one interesting factoid. Other laws that didn't apply to Yerushalayim, conceptually, because it was almost never happened, the law of the Irhani Dakas, the law of the city that was given over to idolatry, where the entire city would be destroyed if it is convicted of having, as a city, got over to idolatry. That doesn't apply to Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim, again, is not Beis Achuzazchem. The passage describes that condemned city as a city in of your holdings. Yerushalayim, nobody had a holding in it. It belonged to everybody. It really belonged to nobody. Same with the Egla Rufa, the famous case of the murder victim outside a city. Nobody knows who is the culprit. And the elders of the city closest to the body have to go out and go through a whole ritual in which they behead a calf as an atonement, and they say, our hands have not shed this blood. That didn't apply to Yerushalayim because of passages that, again, because it didn't belong to anybody. There was no tumas negoyim. There was no defilement of, no houses in Yerushalayim could become tameh, becoming defiled because of tzaras, because of leprosy. Also because it had a technicality having to do with ownership of the land. You were not allowed to give a place to live to a ger toshav. A ger toshav was somebody who was not Jewish, who accepted upon himself the 7 Noahide laws and lived among the Jewish people. He was a believer, and he was to be treated extremely generously, not in Jerusalem, because the place in Yerushalayim because the Torah says that he shall live with you ba'achad she'arecha, in one of your cities. But Yerushalayim was not your city. It was God's city, so to speak, or certainly not yours. Nobody could own it. Similarly, you couldn't rent houses in Yerushalayim. There's a long and intricate discussion about, is that only during the three Yomim Tovim of Pesach, Sukkot, and Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, or was it all year long? Because you needed to make room for pilgrims, for the people who are Ola Regel, who were going up to Yerushalayim, and therefore you couldn't rent out houses because you wanted them to be available for free to pilgrims, because there was such a crowd coming for the three pilgrimage festivals, and therefore you're not allowed to rent out a house in Yerushalayim. You didn't really own it anyway to rent it. And you can never sell a house forever, even though Batei Arichama, we just learned about this last week in the Torah, that houses inside a walled city, after 12 months, if they're not redeemed, they go forever to the purchaser. That didn't happen in Yerushalayim because nobody could own a house long enough to sell it for that way. Again, there are complicated laws regarding this, but the idea being that Yerushalayim had a totally different set of laws governing it. So those are some laws having to do with its international dimension. Now, there are other practices that derive from the desire to protect the purity, halachic, the purity from contamination. Because Yerushalayim, what was the industry of Yerushalayim? The Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. What did they do in the Beis HaMikdash? They did karbanos. That had to be done with purity. They had to make sure that the Kohanim remained pure. And people who were coming to the Beis HaMikdash had to be able to remain pure to enter the temple grounds or to bring a karban. So therefore, let's use a modern, very present day analogy. Ritual contamination, Tuma, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash was like COVID nowadays, which means that's, you wash your hands, so to speak, the way we wash with COVID. There are all kinds of major defenses against having impurity spread. So for example, you weren't allowed to have any boards or porches protruding out from a building over the public domain, because if somebody would die and they'd go under, their body would be under that protrusion, the defilement would spread to anybody else who was under that protrusion. We didn't want any defilement spreading in Yerushalayim. You weren't allowed to have any garbage dumps in Yerushalayim. First of all, because it was unbecoming for a royal city, meaning God's royalty, but also because garbage dumps would bring rats, and rats eventually die. And a dead sheretz it's a major source of contamination. You weren't allowed to raise chickens there. Same reason, because they would eventually cause shvatzim and tuma. You believe it or not, you couldn't maintain trees in Yerushalayim or gardens. First of all, because the trees could spread defilement of a dead person, but also because in order to till the soil, to nurture the trees in the gardens, you'd have to use dung, and dung smelled. We didn't want bad smells in Yerushalayim to compete with the beautiful fragrance of the Torah, certainly. So Yerushalayim, as we'll see in a minute, had many environmental laws. But here, even just because of defilement, we couldn't have trees or gardens that would have exotic trees in them. The law was that if somebody who died had to be taken out immediately, did not stay overnight in Yerushalayim. Even today, they still have that practice, but not for the defilement reasons, for other reasons. We might get into that. And transporting bones through the city, no. Just like nowadays, you have signs that say that certain trucks have to go around the perimeter expressway. They can't go through town. Similarly, people were not allowed to take any bones for burial through the city. City had a very special status because of its sensitivity to defilement. Now, some say that some of the concerns about the dead had to do not with the defilement issue, but with the holiness of Yerushalayim. And the difference would be that nowadays we still do worry about the holiness, even though we don't worry about Tumah. So some practices still, to this day, are in effect, but not with the same severity. There are other laws that were designed to preserve the beauty of Yerushalayim. You weren't allowed to have any furnaces in Yerushalayim because we didn't want smoke, which would then darken the walls and give the city a very worn down look. Like I said, we didn't want the fertilizer that was necessary to grow trees and gardens. The exception was rose gardens. they were planted. There were many roses in Yerushalayim because they needed the roses as one ingredient for the ketores, and therefore roses were planted. But in general, we didn't want the necessary fertilizer to support the gardens, so we didn't have gardens. The streets of Yerushalayim were cleaned every day, so much so that the laws of lost and found in Yerushalayim are different than the laws anywhere else, because based on the fact that the streets are cleaned every day, you know that when you find something on the streets of Yerushalayim, it hasn't been lost that long because the streets are cleaned every day. Because it was a city that was dignified, because it housed the Beis HaMikdash. Believe it or not, anywhere within a certain radius of Yerushalayim, we know that the grapes of the fourth year had to be brought up to Yerushalayim to be consumed there, or you could redeem them and get the money and bring the money to Yerushalayim and buy fruit. But when you're within a radius of a certain radius of Yerushalayim, you could not redeem the grapes. Why? We wanted people bringing the grapes to Yerushalayim to make sure that the streets of Yerushalayim were adorned with grapes. There's an abundance of grapes in Yerushalayim. You can imagine what a street looks like when you've got grapes all over the place, right? Also, they wanted grapes around because they wanted to make sure to have pure sources for wine for the libations, because as you know, we had the yayin, the Niskei Hayayin, the libations that went along with many korbanos, particularly on the Musafim, the supplemental sacrifices that were offered on Yom Tov. So we wanted to make sure to have lots of grapes, so therefore they instituted the measure that you couldn't redeem your grapes if you were too close to Yerushalayim. We wanted you to come with your grapes. Now, there are other measures that were instituted because of the centrality of Yerushalayim in the national life of the Jewish people. So, for example, Yerushalayim was the first to set up a whole system of educators for children, because Ki Mitzion Tetzei Sarah, from Zion comes Torah. Therefore, we had to make sure that the children of Yerushalayim never grew up without knowing Torah thoroughly. So there was an elaborate system of educators for the children of Yerushalayim. We know that when Rosh Hashanah occurs on Shabbos, we don't sound the shofar. Why? Because we're concerned about transporting the shofar to learn how to do it, and we'll do that on Shabbos. Therefore, we abolished the sounding of shofar on Shabbos, which is an astounding thing. In Yerushalayim, they blew the shofar on Shabbos because Yerushalayim was considered to be like in the presence of the Jewish court because of its status, because of its significance, because of the mindset that you're in when you're in Yerushalayim. We're not concerned that you'll forget, and therefore there was shofar on Shabbos in Yerushalayim, according to many opinions. Same with lulav and esrog, which we don't have on Shabbos Sukkos because we're afraid you'll transport it. In Yerushalayim, we didn't have that concern, and you had a lulav on Shabbos. Once we're talking about lulav, I want to mention that according to many opinions, even nowadays, even though the mitzvah in the Torah of lulav and esrog is only the first day, the rest of Sukkot that we practice it is only midrabanan, a rabbinic requirement. The reason the rabbis enacted it is because in Yerushalayim, it was a requirement from Torah law, all 7 days. You shall rejoice before Hashem your God. That means that when you're in Yerushalayim, right in the presence of God, you have a mitzvah of lulav and esrog all 7 days. As we mentioned before, you were not supposed to be able to redeem your Meiser Sheni because your tithe, your second tithe that was brought to Yerushalayim, because we wanted people to tarry in Yerushalayim and learn the fear of heaven from being there. And of course, we know that in Birkas Hamazon, in benching, every single day that we bench, or in Al Hamichya after a snack, we mention Yerushalayim in Shmona Esrei 3 times a day. At weddings, the brachas refer to Yerushalayim. You can't get married without praying for Jerusalem. And of course, when we daven, we're always facing Yerushalayim. Wherever you are in the world, you could be facing north, facing south, facing east, facing west. We American Jews keep on thinking that there's a law about the east. There's nothing about east. We don't care about east. We care about Jerusalem, and it happens to be to our east. There are parts of Jerusalem where when you daven, you're facing south because you're facing the Makom HaMikdash, you're facing the place of the Mikdash. So the point is, you're supposed to face either Jerusalem or in Jerusalem face the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, now we all know that there's a practice as well when you build a house not to complete it totally. There's an unfinished part of the house where you don't paint or otherwise coat the wall, leave it unfinished as a way of remembering Yerushalayim. Jewish women, many have the practice of when they make a fancy meal, they leave one dish incomplete. Jewish women are encouraged, they don't have to, but they're encouraged when you're putting on all your jewelry for a fancy affair, leave one item of jewelry off to remember Jerusalem. Of course, breaking a glass at a wedding, right? And then, of course, there's a halacha that when you see, we don't practice this part, when you see Yerushalayim b'churbanah, when you see Yerushalayim in its destruction, meaning when the Beis Hamikdash is not there, not when you see the Temple Mount or the temple destroyed. When you see Jerusalem without a Beis Hamikdash, you're supposed to rend your garment. We don't do that nowadays because there's a lot of debate about when it's under Jewish control. When the cities of Judah are under Jewish control, you probably don't have to tear Kriya. But when you see the Beis Hamikdash for the first time in a while, you do have to tear Kriya. You do have to rend your garment on the left side over the heart in the way that one does when one loses a parent's lower leg. So it's a very, very serious thing and a very gut-wrenching experience to tear Kriya for the destruction of Yerushalayim. In Yerushalayim, during the times of the Beis Hamikdash, on Yom Kippur, they stayed up all night. Not only the Kohen Gadol, he had to stay up all night for all kinds of reasons, but the Kohen Gadol, in order to help him stay up, the most significant leaders of Yerushalayim would stay up and study Torah all night so that the noise of the Torah study would keep the Kohen Gadol awake, right? So you can kind of get a sense of what was going on in Yerushalayim. I want to tell you, under the guise of things that you maybe not know about Yerushalayim, when you look at the Kotel, from the Kotel Plaza, you'll see that there's you can tell what the original stones of the Kotel, of the retaining wall, the western wall, it was the western side of the Beis Hamikdash. So you can see where the original stones are, and you can see there's a little gap where the line of the stones is interrupted and it's filled in with much smaller stones. That's because there was an earthquake, a major earthquake in Yerushalayim. I'm not sure I have the exact date. I think it was 1837. I'm not sure. But there was another major earthquake in 1835 in Tzfat, in Tzfat. And I think about 2,000 Jews died in that earthquake. The earthquake caused a huge landslide. The landslide crushed many homes. Children were killed. Basically, the Jewish community of Tzfat was wiped out, almost totally wiped out. There's a shul in Tzfat, forget the name of it right now, but there's a shul in Tzfat that has like one wall that wasn't destroyed, the wall near the Aron Kodesh with the Sefer Torah in it. According to the narrative, the Makubal, the Rav there, who was a disciple of the Ari, sensed the earthquake before it came, and right before it hit, he said, whoever wants to live should come here and be near this wall. And that was the only place in the whole area that didn't collapse. And so there was a major destruction. The reason I mention this is because there's a famous hesped, a eulogy offered by the Chassam Sofer for the Jews of Tzfat. Word reaches Europe, reaches Pressburg, and the Chassam Sofer offered a eulogy because they had to take note of this horrible disaster. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews who died, and the community wiped out. And the Chassam Sofer, you have to appreciate the Chassam Sofer of Moshe Sofer. It's not possible for somebody on my level to describe who the Chassam Sofer was. Meaning that there are first-person accounts of conversations that he would have on a regular basis with Eliyahu Hanavi. Okay, we're talking about people who literally hid. like in a kind of CIA operation, to find out what exactly was going on Fridays in the Chassam Sofer's office. And he had conversations, give and take, with Eliyahu Hanavi. That just gives you a little idea. There much more. The Chassam Sofer was an exceptional leader. Sometimes we trivialize who he was by referring simply to some of his rulings or some of the things or some of the ways that he fought Reform Judaism or the seeds of Reform Judaism, but he was an exceptionally holy man. And therefore, the things that he said, you had to really take them seriously. In his hesped for the city of Tzfat, he quotes a medrash. It's a famous hesped. He quotes a medrash Socher Tov, which is a kind of a medrash. And the medrash itself quotes Eliyahu Hanavi. The passage says, Hamabit la'aretz v'tir'ad. God looks at the earth and it trembles, which seems to refer to earthquakes. So says Eliyahu Hanavi, a comment on this passage, according to the Medrash, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks down at the land and sees so many other cities growing in fancy structures being developed, but Yerushalayim is chareva v'shamema, desolate and destroyed. Tirad ba'aretz, the ground itself trembles. God himself is angered by the fact that nobody's noticing, nobody's taking note that Jerusalem is chareva v'shamema and other cities are growing. So Eliyahu says that earthquakes are caused by no one noticing that Yerushalayim is still in its destruction. It doesn't bother them. So the Chassam Sofer said that according to Eliyahu, that earthquakes are a measure of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's unhappiness. He says, the Chassam Sofer says this. If it wasn't the Chassam Sofer, we wouldn't have to pay this much attention to it. But Chassam Sofer said in his eulogy for the Jews of Tzfat, Kinatz Yerushalayim asasazos. The jealousy of Jerusalem caused this earthquake because people were at that point moving to Israel. Let's say the religious Zionist movement, which is not what I mean. It's not what we mean nowadays when we say religious Zionists. The religious Jews who were coming to Israel out of love for Israel, they were going at that time focusing their attention on Tzfat and ignoring Yerushalayim. And Chassam Sofer famously didn't appreciate that at all. As a matter of fact, in another place in his writings and his responsa, the Chassam Sofer decries the focus on Lag BaOmer in Meron and turning it into a new holiday. He says, of course, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai was an unbelievable leader, and there's no question that his yahrzeit is special, but you can't make a new Yom Tov. And he was very concerned about the fact also that there was so much focus on Meron and not on Yerushalayim. So he says, Yerushalayim is Shar HaShamayim. It's the gateway to heaven. It's Ir Shechubra Lo Yachtov. It's the city that brings everybody together. It's Har HaMoriah. It's where the Akedah was. It's where Yaakov Avinu slept. He writes this there. He said, it's the house of Hashem. It's the mountain to which is Talpios. It's the mountain to which all prayers are directed. And we know from the Gemara, the Shekhinah never leaves the Kotel. And yet he says, for 100 years now, everyone is focusing on Tzfat. And Yerushalayim is forgotten altogether. And he said, I can justify what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did by bringing this horrible earthquake. Again, he's not saying it's okay with me or they deserved it. He's saying we have to understand Yerushalayim has a life of its own, and it doesn't tolerate being ignored. It's a form of jealousy which is not petty. It's a demanding attention for the dignity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. An interesting historical note, in the early 1800s, there were groups coming to Eretz Yisrael to settle over there. These are religious groups, and Eretz Yisrael could not sustain them. And they constantly were appealing to the diaspora for support. And there were wealthy, successful Jews around the diaspora in Turkey and Europe who needed money. Matter of fact, it's another story about the difference between Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews and who is being asked to support what communities. It's another historical story that's fascinating. But they all constantly needed money. And they sent for money. They sent Mishalochim, various people, at great expense from Israel to the various communities to raise money. So they decided to form a va'ad, a whole committee in the diaspora to unite all these efforts. And the Chassam Sofer was one of the people involved in forming this committee. And they appointed a banker from Holland, whose name was Tzvi Hirsch Laren. And the bylaws of this VAD were that no one could come from Israel to raise money. They all had to go to this VAD. They were trying to centralize it because there were so many requests and there was so much expense in sending people from Israel to the diaspora to raise money. They wanted the people in Israel to be able to count on one central address. And they also they wanted to be able to know that they were funneling the money to the right place. Very similar to the problems we have nowadays. So they said that no one could come to raise money. You had to go to the Va'ad. Okay. And so there were Jews at that time who wanted to build a Churva Shul. There was a Jew by the name of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, not the famous Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, who we know from all of the various laws and legislations and takanas that he made. This is a different Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. And he was devoted to rebuilding the Churva Shul in Yerushalayim at that time. He actually was a kind of a makubal, and he actually was sure that building that shul would bring Mashiach. This is very relatively close after the Shabtai Tzvi debacle, the false Mashiach, and he felt that the proper Mashiach would come if we rebuilt the Churva Shul. In order to do that, he led the community in Yerushalayim to borrow money from Arab neighbors who were wealthy, and he gave them a guarantee. And when it came time to pay, alas, they didn't have the money. The Arabs, in retribution for not being paid back, destroyed the shul and the kehillah. It was a terrible chapter in Jewish history. The Jews endangered themselves by actually borrowing from the Arabs. And there are many cases where Jews paid back Arabs, by the way. It's another fascinating aspect of Jerusalem history. But here they failed, and the Arabs destroyed the Churva Shul that was built with the money that they lent them and the kehillah itself. So there was a Jew named Reb Mendel Mishklov. He was a disciple of the Vilna Gaon, and he wanted to rebuild it. And he comes and he has to go to Tzvi Hirsch Laren, the head of this VAD, to get the money. Tzvi Hirsch says, no, we're not giving you the money because the money is desperately needed for basic needs. We can't build a shul. People are starving. We can't give the money to build a shul. And people were very upset. They felt that he didn't understand how holy the shul was. The Churva Shul is an unbelievably holy place. It really is. And they were working off of Torah sources that say that when you rebuild the shuls of Yerushalayim, you are actually on the way to rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. So they felt that he didn't get it, and they actually wanted to excommunicate him for refusing to give money for the shul. And they came to the Chassam Sofer, and the Chassam Sofer, in one of his responsa, matter of fact, I looked it up today, in responsa Reich Gimel 203, he ruled in favor of Tzvi Laren, and that was it. 15 years later, they ended up building it again, and then it was destroyed. And then, as we know, it was rebuilt in 2010. It was dedicated. Where'd the money come from? The Israeli government gave them the money. Anyway, so that's just a very important historical background, just to get an idea of the role that the Chassam Sofer played in the affairs of Yerushalayim, even though the Chassam Sofer never made it. He himself writes how he yearned to get to Yerushalayim, but he never made it to Yerushalayim. Now, getting back to, we mentioned before that Binyamin owned the land on which the Holy of Holies was built. Why did he merit having the Holy of Holies? Why did the tribe of Binyamin merit having the Holy of Holies in this section? So the Medrash gives several different reasons. The Medrash says it's an analogy to a king who has several sons, and the king is coming to visit, and the youngest son says, there's no way that he's going to come visit with me. I'm the youngest one. He's going to come to my older brothers first, before my oldest brother, and after that, my next brother. He'll never come to me. So Binyamin, being the youngest, was humble, and humility is the best housing for the Shekhinah. And therefore, the Holy of Holies was there. That's one shot. Another interpretation, Binyamin is the only one of the, the only one of the tribes who's not born in Chutz La'aretz, is not born outside of Israel. He's born in Israel. So for the Shekhinah and the Holy of Holies to rest in that place, it rested in the place belonging to a tribe that was born in Eretz Israel. Another pshat the Medrash offers is that every one of the other tribes was involved in the sale of Yosef. And we want to avoid any reference or sign of the sale of Yosef. And so the Holy of Holies is in the section of Binyamin, not to in any way arouse any, so to speak, any mention or reference to the sale of Yosef, because that's sinas chinam, that's what destroys the Beis HaMikdash. So we don't want that in the Holy of Holies. And then the fourth thing, the king, the Medrash gives the same kind of analogy. King has many sons, but all the other ones grew up and they made their own lives. But the youngest one was still at home and still took time to take care of the parents, and they developed a special, what we call in Hebrew, a ben zakunim, that son of my old years. So the Shekhinah wants to be by the young child who grew up during his old age and took care of him, and therefore Shekhinah is in the tribe of Binyamin. Another famous comment by the Chassam Sofer that gives you an idea about Yerushalayim, and this will close with this because it gives us a feeling for the future of Yerushalayim. There's a halacha that you're not allowed to leave Yerushalayim with any of the kachim.
I did. Thank you. Hello, how are you? Welcome. Charger today.
Okay. You're not allowed to leave Yerushalayim with any of the meats of kachim. It's called pasol b'yotzei. The meats of the holy sacrifices had to be consumed sometimes inside of the courtyard of Yerushalayim, of the Beis HaMikdash, and if not there, inside of the walls of Jerusalem proper. You were not allowed to leave with any of that. If you did, the meat had to be destroyed by fire. And if you realize that you left Yerushalayim inadvertently with, say, a meat in a pouch or whatever it is, you'd have to go back to Yerushalayim. The Gemara Mesachim says that if you reached Mount Scopus, that was the point before which, if you noticed that, you'd have to go back and burn the meat inside of Yerushalayim. If you had passed Mount Scopus, you didn't need to go back. You would burn it wherever you were. So the Chassam Sofer don't understand. Well, understand, if you have to burn it in the Beis HaMikdash, why is it that if you're too far away, then you don't have to go back? So he explains based on the passage in Zechariah, the 14th chapter in Zechariah, where Zechariah envisions that one day HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to add to Yerushalayim. It's going to be a huge city, which, by the way, it's unbelievable already what Yerushalayim has become. So it says the Chassam Sofer, based on the idea that one day Yerushalayim will occupy so much more territory. So to a significant degree, that added territory that at that moment isn't Yerushalayim, but one day it will be Yerushalayim when it's expanded. So the roots are planted. It already has the seed, so to speak, of the holiness of Yerushalayim. And therefore, when you're outside of Mount Scopus, you're actually still in Yerushalayim. And therefore, where you're burning it there, you're still burning it, so to speak, in the future Yerushalayim. And therefore, says the Chassam Sofer, it's considered like you're not really taking it out of Yerushalayim. And therefore, you burn it where you are. So the point is that Yerushalayim was designed to, there's in the original plan envisioned by the Nevi, Yerushalayim will continue to expand. And there are midrashim that talk about it running all the way to Shechem, which right now it's amazing. If you leave Yerushalayim and travel towards Nablus, which is Shechem, the outskirts of Yerushalayim are barely recede in the background when you see Shechem. Yerushalayim is really taking up a huge area now. So all of Eretz Yisrael really has a large connection to Yerushalayim itself. There's a lot more we can say, But I'm just hoping that through appreciating some of the practices and some of the prohibitions and some of the attitudes that have developed over the centuries about Yerushalayim as manifest in halacha, we can have a sense of the holiness of Yerushalayim and also a sense of the future, the destiny of Yerushalayim, which in Mirz Hashem will be rebuilt with the glory of God restored in the Beis Hamikdash as its crown. B'meher of Yameinu. We are privileged to be living in times of unbelievable developments. And we don't always understand the direction that things are going. And right now, there's not a pleasant time in Yerushalayim. Literally this week, tremendous amount of violence happening. As a matter of fact, it happens to be a very interesting story that this section of Nachalat Shimon, which really was a Jewish-owned section well before the mandate. And Jews are now trying, even offering money to reclaim this area, and it's going to the Supreme Court, and the Arabs are very, very upset about it because it became occupied by Arab refugees. It's really a refugee camp now. There's a tremendous amount of violence that's erupting there. Most of the newspapers will not tell you that this was originally owned by Jews who were chased out of that area. They will not mention that because that might give you a balanced story. But anyway, we pray for the peace of Yerushalayim. We pray for the ultimate redemption of Yerushalayim. And may this day of celebration for seeing the hand of God in history continue to develop until we see Uval L'Tzion Goel, the Redeemer will come to Tzion. Thank you all for your attention.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Very interesting.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Great to see you all. I'm amazed at this. We actually ran a conflict with Mincha and Ma'ariv. Mincha and Ma'ariv has another 50 or 60 people in there. And still we had a very sizable group. It's great to see you. And it just shows the love that we all have for Yerushalayim. Be well.
You too.
Rabbi,
Thank you
Rabbi,
all.
do a chat about the shul and Sfad.
About the Shul and Sfad?
Yeah, I sent you a chat.
Oh, good. Okay, let me take a look at it before I sign off. Thank you. Ooh, there's a few chats here. Whoa. Let's see what I'm missing here.
It's the one about Abuhav, Rabbi Abuhav.
Oh, that's the Shul. You're right. That's the one. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you, Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhav. Yep, 1837. Yeah. Okay. I think actually it might have actually been 35, but it doesn't matter.
No, well, it said 837,
Okay.
but 1759, it was rebuilt. It was destroyed with an earthquake and then rebuilt and then destroyed again.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhav. Thank you.
I learned something new tonight.
The well-known Makubal. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Same to you.